Our fourth speaker is Professor Jan Woleński. He's professor of philosophy at the Jagiellonian University. I understand he has written numerous papers, around 800 of them, around 20 books on logic, epistemology, philosophical logic, history, Alfred Tarski, essays in the history of logic, and so on. He today is going to talk to us on what we've all been waiting for, the status of church's thesis. Please welcome Professor Woleński.
I am a conservative speaker, so I have no slides or PowerPoint. Also, I am in a difficult situation because almost everything about the status of church's thesis was said at this conference, and probably I could not read any paper or book and only use information which was given in other papers. So I will start with a almost naive statement, namely a formulation of church's thesis, which is commonly quoted, that the function is effectively computable, even only if it is recursive. I prefer this formulation, maybe for some subjective reasons, but this formulation is simple, but it immediately leads to some problems. People usually say, well, it is an identification of two concepts or two terms or labels. One precise, mathematical, second vague, intuitive, ordinary, and so on. The first question is whether this identification is extensional or intentional. In fact, it cannot be purely extensional because it is difficult to say that extension of a vague concept is identical with extension of precise concept. So there's obviously an intentional aspect. It was stressed several times, for example, by Andrzej Mostowski, who said that in church's thesis there is an inevitable semantic element. And it cannot be eliminated by very popular explanation that intuitively computable means computable step by step in finite number of steps and so on, because the same problems like with effective calculable or computable we have with these other elements. Next question is, what does it mean ordinary? It is one of labels very frequently used in explanation of church's thesis. What? Mathematical, common sense, peoples in street, and so on. Stuart Shapiro invoked Friedrich Waismann, a philosopher, so I will refer to another analytic philosopher approximately of the same time and in the same fact environment, namely Gilbert Ryle, who in a paper, Ordinary Language, contrasted two phrases. One is the use of ordinary language, and second, the ordinary use of expressions. And he says that people use ordinary language in daily talks. However, ordinary use of language is standard, stock, normal, typical, paradigmatic, and so on. So it seems to me that when we say that a precisation of calculable, computable, effectively computable in the sense that is the ordinary meaning, it means mathematical ordinary meaning. So it is almost a technical term. We cannot say that we understand ordinary like in the case of children, for example, who use apples in order to show that 3 plus 2 is 5, for example. So, but if we have such elementary problems, it means that is something hidden behind such simple and elementary and obvious identification. So we can distinguish at least 3 groups of problems related to Church's thesis. First is mathematical. Mathematical is related to the right side of this equivalence, and is recursivity, algorithms, processes, Turing machines, and so on. There are exact mathematical problems. There are mathematical theories of these objects or items. However, of course, it doesn't expose all questions related to thesis, Church's thesis. So then we have foundational issues, which I mean foundations as mathematical foundations, as part of mathematics. For example, people ask, how is Church's thesis related to intuitionism? That we should replace recursive by primitive recursive, for example. Or what is provable by Church's thesis, and in which way Stanisław Krajewski spoke about this problem yesterday. Or what does it mean that Church's thesis is a kind of reducibility axiom for intuitionistic mathematics? They are well-defined problems. In which sense, if any, Church's thesis entails incompleteness? How is related to Tarski's theorem that the truth predicate is not definable in arithmetic, and so on. And the third group, there are philosophical questions, and roughly speaking, we can divide into issues of philosophy of mathematics. For example, is a relation between realism and Church's thesis. Charles will speak about that tomorrow. And also some general questions, epistemological questions, and my problem belongs to this group. So the status of Church's thesis, this is a sentence, an assertion, a statement. You can read it, and we can discuss what kind of statement and so on. Of course, these questions are interrelated in many ways, but we can distinguish. And there is a very simple criterion which question is general philosophical in this context, if it has no influence on mathematical issues. So there's other problems that can be discussed. For example, are there applications of Church's thesis to other fields? Philosophy of mind, complexity problem. So my belief is that there are no direct applications, but I will skip this issue. No, and we have also, so to speak, theological applications. It was alluded by Staszek yesterday, but people who read our book edited by Adam Janusz and myself about Church's thesis and read preface. Maybe remember that the first proposal was made to Cambridge University Press, and Adam got an answer that we sent this proposal to Department of Religious Studies, but they are not interested. Ontos Verlag, which published this book, at first replied similarly, but after 1 hour or 2 hours, they corrected that we made a mistake, so we accept this proposal. By the way, this collection was very strongly criticized by Peter Smith from Cambridge, so please be a little bit skeptical, because Cambridge is not a good place to at least now, to speak about Church's thesis. Now, I would like to present a partly fictive story. Imagine that at the end of the 20s of last century, someone said, well, we should define computable functions, because now there are quarrels between mathematicians. Borel, for example, proposed computable real numbers. Cantor computed high infinities. So this concept is at odds with mathematical tradition. By the way, I guess that about 1830, nobody would say effective computability or calculability, because it was obvious that there is no other way to compute than effectively. And then someone said, well, we perhaps should use recursivity, the concept of recursivity, but it is employed by some mathematician on the occasion of inductive definition, so let us stay with computability. And we define primitive computable functions, then general, then someone would suggest partial. So the term recursivity would be avoided, and probably Church thesis wouldn't be stated, because it would be no reason to say that we identify computability and recursivity. However, all problems could be still discussed. Yes. Is this formalization of computability okay? Ackermann function was, for example, known at the time. I don't remember whether he used the concept of recursive or not in his paper. Probably not, because it was in 1925, I guess. So why this story is not quite not a fiction? Because, for example, Turing did something like that. He simply defined a class of machines or mechanically computable by machine, and then he precisely defined the concept of Turing machine. Or the construction presented today by Yuri also could be given without any appeal to computability and recursivity, let's say 100 years earlier. So in this case, we would have the situation that some intuitively used, but or in the sense of Ryle, as the ordinary mathematical concept, a category would be precisely defined by strict mathematical devices. Now, a typical classification of approaches to Church's thesis as a statement. A sentence can be, as a classification is, for example, this. First, it is empirical hypothesis. It was maintained by Post, by Nelson, yesterday by Yari. Then axiom or provable theorem, Zik, Mendelssohn, Gurewicz, as a definition by Church, and as an explication. It was mentioned several times, but Roman Murawski and myself, we tried to elaborate this approach in the collection on Church's thesis after 70 years. Now some comments about these four approaches. First, of course, there are several empirical reasons supporting Church's thesis. But look, what is supported by such arguments? Yesterday, for example, in Yari's paper, he said, well, there are some constraints about computability. So, in fact, empirical arguments, in my opinion at least, support these constraints, not identification. Because, for example, that human abstract, or by the way, abstract human mind or abstract human being is something very strange, as used by Gandhi. Why it is important, at least philosophically, maybe, of course not mathematically, that we build an analytical model of computability, even normative model, and then we show that this recursivity satisfied similar constraints, and it is not a typical empirical checking, testing, verification, or falsification, or something like that. It is much more conceptual work than it looks for the first sight. Now, it was very much said about axiomatic approach, so I will not, and about probability. So only one remark. It is true that there are several informal arguments for Church's thesis. And if someone likes, can call these arguments proofs or demonstrations. A similar problem is in theology. Are arguments for God's existence formulated by Thomas Aquinas, for example, proofs or not? It is difficult to solve this question without defining. But I fully agree with arguments given by Gurewicz today, but only one additional remark, that every mathematical proof, at least I was taught by logicians, can be or converted into a formal proof. It is not done very frequently, but in principle we can do that. However, proofs offered by Smith or Mendelssohn are certainly not convertible into formal proofs, because there is no theory in which we can do that. It is an argument. So, and recent approach is this problem of definition. You know, when I was a student in Poland, our teachers taught us about definitions very much. It was a favorite topic of elementary logic. So when Church said that, I propose the following definition of computability. So the first question is, what kind of definition? We have several kinds of definitions. Real, nominal. Certainly he was not interested in defining a word, but something much more substantial. However, if we say that one concept is vague, other is precise, what are criteria of correctness of such a definition? It is not a definition by genus proximum et differentiam specificam, where these conditions are clearly stated, that definition cannot be too narrow or too wide. So it is difficult to apply this kind of definition. Then we have analytic, synthetic, and regulative. Certainly he didn't propose an analytic definition of the word computable. Certainly his definition was not an arbitrary proposal. But with regulative definition is the same problem. What is criterion of correctness? So it seems that no definition in the traditional sense can be used here. Of course, inductive definition also not, by axioms also not, because it requires some theories. Finally, this is approach by explication proposed by another, this method was elaborated by Rudolf Carnap. He stated several conditions that so-called explicans should be similar to explicandum or explicatum, simple, fruitful, and should be placed in a theory. Carnap was, of course, very, very optimistic about explications. He considered this method as maybe universal, philosophical, scientific. However, I am not so convinced about this method as typical scientific method. But however, it is a typical, one of typical philosophical methods. So with Murawski, we propose to say that explication, at least in this case, offers something like normalization of a vague but still ordinary mathematical concept. And this word normalization seems to me very proper. And this is only a word, it doesn't solve anything, all problems remain, of course. However, from epistemological point of view, I guess that we can show at least what kind of conceptual work is required in order to clarify the concept of computability, calculability, all algorithms, something like that, putting at the right hand of this equivalence a precise concept. And the last issue concern, the status of Church's thesis as elaborated by the Kantian distinction, analytic and synthetic proposition. So usually almost all people who use this distinction or criticize it understand analyticity as something very absolute. So there are either analytic or synthetic. However, we have several kinds of degrees of analyticity. So we need the concept of relative analyticity. So we state some constraints, for example, about computability, and then a statement in a meta-language, of course, or of some philosophical jargon, is relatively analytic, relatively to these initial conditions. We can change these conditions, of course, but still, how long we accept these conditions, we treat such explanations like relatively analytical. They organize our discourse. Jakob Hintika says that analytical statements are conditions of stability of conceptual systems. And we, of course, can change environment, but we need some analytical elements. And probably the same could be said about problem of a priority or a posteriority of Church's thesis. It is also relatively a priori. And yesterday, Stanisław Krajewski proposed or collected a list of similar problems from the history of logic and mathematics, similar theses of statements, of assertions, namely this extensional definition of function as a relation and as a set of pairs, Tarski's definition of truth, logical validity as truth in all models, Weierstrass' definition of continuity, Cauchy-Weierstrass' definition of limit, the definition of measure, the definition of topological dimensions, the definition of velocity by means of derivatives, logical correctness as logical tautology, Dedekind's and Cantor's definition of real numbers. Of course, we can multiply this list almost infinitely. However, it seems to me that there are two groups, and we should distinguish two groups. One is Tarski's definition of truth, logical validity, logical correctness as logical tautology. There are real assertions, which were assertions that Aristotle's theory of truth is precised by Tarski's semantic definition. It is an almost exact counterpart of Church's thesis concerning computability and recursivity, unless, of course, we say that maybe the concept of truth is still more vague than the concept of computability. However, and there are proposals motivated philosophically, contested by some authors, accepted by others. Philosophical background is much richer in the case of Church's thesis. On the other hand, definition of function, of Weierstrass' definition of continuity, Cauchy-Weierstrass' definition of limit, and so on, and the similar examples. These concepts were used in mathematics before, had they place in defective, from our point of view, mathematical considerations. However, they were fruitfully used on many occasions, essentially contributed to the development of mathematics. Then were replaced by strict constructions. However, as my story, fictive story shows, we could, not very much would change in the history of computability if Church's theses were not stated, were not formulated at all. I guess that almost the development of logic and computer science would be approximately the same without Church's thesis. However, once again, discussions about philosophical aspects probably would be also the same. So my conclusion is quite, maybe not pessimistic, but maybe even strange, that it was an historical accident that Church formulated this thesis. Probably this confluence of ideas were created by real problems, limitative reasons, problems with Hilbert's program, then new discoveries in mathematics which devastated the old idea of what can be computed by pencil, by pen, even by simple calculators, machines, and so on. It was a heavy historical situation, but the thesis was once again a historical accident, but important because we have this conference due to this accident. Thank you.
Thank you. If you consider this thesis as a kind of explication, we have such a case, not very usual, that there are many possible explications of one and the same term. Is it okay? Because there's church, during, post, say, Markov, and so on, yeah? Or these are distinct explication of one and the same term.
Yes,
it's possible.
but it happens I think, very frequently. And these explications are equivalent. I mean, so-called explicances are equivalent. This is one of conditions or one of reasons to say that an explication is correct. This empirical evidence that explication is correct, but not empirical evidence for what is explicated. So, for example, what is the problem with how to explain, you know this better than me, how to explicate modal concepts. We have several possible modal logics, and there is a problem stated by Lemon, I guess. Is there a correct system of modal logic? Which one? S5? ST? So we have no good explication of modalities. In this sense,